Hello, I'm Durham, and welcome to PaTTANpod. If we are going to move students forward, we need to acknowledge that the importance of matching our intervention to student needs. This mismatch of intervention and need is often what causes our students to struggle with actualizing growth and positive student outcomes. Here to help us understand matching intervention to student needs is Dr. Amanda VanDerHeyden. Dr. VanDerHeyden, thank you for joining us today. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Let's jump right in here. When we think about interventions, first we kind of have to take a step back and make sure we understand what are the areas of concern for us and for our students. How can assessments be used to identify students at risk, identify essential math content to work for instruction, and then also how to determine where students are in their learning progression?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so right. It's very difficult often to do that with one measure. In fact, I don't think it's possible to do that with one measure. So the first layer is risk identification, right? Who's in trouble? And one of the things that I think is a really important touch point for systems to be aware of is in the world of math, this often needs to start with a question about, is the entire class potentially at risk? So what happens in math is we do have lots of children who are not attaining the basic proficiencies that they need to be on track. In fact, the average fourth grader is not attaining the level of proficiency that forecasts that the child is likely to enroll or complete a 2 or 4 year degree. And in fact, to reach that level of performance that forecasts successful college enrollment and completion is typically a level of performance that is higher than most state criteria for math proficiency. And so what that means is we really are in a context where we are nationally thinking about how can we up our game in math? How can we really bring children to greater proficiency? So in that context, we have lots of children who really are lagging behind, and that is not a child-specific issue. That is really an instructional issue. That is an expectation issue. And that is something that hopefully over the next decade, we will really see some traction in the US on this question. So the first question then is risk identification. It's impossible to identify really individual students who are at risk when you have large groups of children who are at risk in classes. So what we say is if you find that there are classes of children who are at risk, you really need to deliver a class-wide intervention. That is the only way to introduce variation into the scores from a psychometric perspective such that you have the capacity to really individualize, identify at the individual level who's really in trouble. It's kind of like, you're trying to decide who really has the flu in the midst of a flu epidemic by giving everybody a flu screening. I mean, if you've ever had this experience, a lot of people have, they'll go to the physician, they have symptoms, they know somebody who's had the flu, and the physician will say to them, flu is so widespread in our community right now that there's no point in me giving you the test because if it comes back negative, it's more likely wrong than right. And that's kind of what we're trying to do when we're trying to identify individual children for intervention in math. We've got too much risk to be able to pick kids out. What happens with this, though, is that teachers often want to start with individual intervention.
Yeah.
So that's why it's really an important touch point to consider the place of class-wide math intervention in your toolkit to help you really identify who is at risk. Then your second question is, how do you figure out what they need, right, in terms of intervention? In math, this is really very logical and easy to do. And actually, it's gotten even easier during the course of my career because now we have things like the Common Core state standards. These very clearly lay out expected learning outcomes across grade levels. And we can then identify where do we have children, even groups of children, individual children who are not attaining these learning outcomes like we expect. The thing in math that makes it so wonderful is that we know if children are not attaining those expectations in grade 3, there's no way they can attain the expectations in grade 4 because they build. So then that becomes just a very logical basis for individual intervention or even whole class intervention. So, my approach, what I believe, and I've been doing this work for 20 years, lots of research, and I've been on that bandwagon and that train of trying to find the GOM equivalent for math, right? The oral reading fluency equivalent for math.
Yep.
It is my opinion that it does not exist. Okay. I've certainly failed in my search for it. Everybody I know has failed in their search for it. And here's what I've learned: brief, timed measures. The timing piece is very important from an assessment perspective. That doesn't mean that as we work with children, we're always going to time them, but brief, timed, skill-based measures, direct skill-based measures that speak to the essential understandings that children are expected to master within a context of operation and computation to forecast successful future learning. And this is not hard for us to do. I mean, just a very sort of classic example is that a child's ability in second grade, by the end of second grade, to handle subtraction and addition, to understand the conceptual relationship between addition and subtraction, so you can assess that very easily with a fact families measure, and a child's ability to begin to understand place value, which you can also assess with an addition and a subtraction multi-digit measure. So with 3 measures, you know everything you need to know about where you need to drill down and find the gaps for an individual intervention for a student in second grade. So it becomes really very straightforward. That's of course how I operate, and we always use more than one measure, but they're brief and they are they're very much tied to these keystone understandings that we can identify at each grade level in the fall, in the winter, and in the spring.
I want to highlight something you had said there, and there were 2 things you had said. Making sure that we are clear and understand and admit when we don't have a single student issue, but we have a class-wide concern. And therefore, we need to be careful to issue a class-wide intervention, not just kind of right away jump to individual student interventions. But another thing you had said, when we think about kind of these brief, timed, skill-based assessments, using more than one so we get a really good picture of our students, is that they're very purposeful. They're not kind of willy-nilly, well, let's try this one, let's see what this results get, but they're very purposeful. They're tied to those essential skills that we know will move or predict students' future success when they go beyond 3rd or 4th grade.
Right. And so, in my work, I built an assessment generator, and it generates about 130 assessments on demand from kindergarten through grade 8. So then the question is, how do you make sense of that? How does that become not just 130 disparate and disconnected skills? And the answer is, from my perspective, there really are about 7 major areas of understanding in math that, the math people sort of probably hate the simplification of math to 7 major areas of understanding. But from a frontline teacher, assessment and intervention perspective, if you want to improve mathematical competence in your classroom, here they are. Yeah. It's adding variables and numbers. It's taking variables and numbers. It's ordinal position, place value understanding, sort of quantity comparison understandings with different quantity representations. It's multiplicative reasoning, proportional reasoning, and solving for an unknown and creating equivalent quantities. That's it. If children have those understandings, which you start in kindergarten, you start with computation related performances that reflect those understandings, and you work on those very systematically all the way through, you're really giving children sort of life skills to be able to think, to problem solve, to demonstrate flexibility in choosing how to solve a problem. So for, just give you an example, we had a math coach email us in our system or submit a question through our support portal a couple of years ago. And this was a math coach in middle school. And this math coach was talking about an order of operations problem. And I don't remember the exact problem, but it involved distributing a term and then factoring the same term out after you did something with it. And what this person understood is that what you do at order of operations is, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. Let's solve exactly what's in the parentheses, which resulted in a decimal quantity, and then multiply that by the same factor, by the way, outside of the parentheses, which that's an inverse operation. So what happens is if any person understands how multiplication and division works, I mean, it's a very simple thing. There is no need to solve that. And in fact, if you do, you're going to get a repeating decimal, and that's going to give you an incorrect answer at the end of the day. If you multiply some quantity by quantity, and then you divide the result by the same quantity that you multiplied it by, it will always be your starting quantity, right?
Sure.
And that was lost on the math coach. So this is why it's so important. And this is the part that I really believe is well intended that the math ed folks are talking about, is when you teach algorithm only approaches to working in math, you really shortchange children, because there is this very coherent body of knowledge around creating equivalent quantities and inverse operations and expectation of quantity, and how you can set up problems to solve for an unknown, which is what all of mathematical thinking is about. And we really want to empower that flexibility in children. And so the way that we can do that is not to avoid timing children. Turns out that's not a big deal. Not to avoid giving direct instruction within the context of the algorithm. The algorithm works for a reason, right?
Yeah.
But the key is to really unpack that for the learner, so that when they forget it, which they will, they can reason their way back to it using the mathematical understanding that they already have.
So we really want to work on these 7 themes, if you will, in mathematics, these 7 concepts and understanding, so that we can expand and broaden our students' math knowledge. I want to pivot just a little bit here. We're talking about, possibly having class-wide interventions, or identifying students who are in need for more skills, or potentially having individual interventions. And we get this question a lot from our teachers. What are some evidence-aligned practices that a teacher could employ in their classroom that would eliminate the need to purchase a formal intervention program? Because some of them just don't have that option to do that.
Yeah. Okay. So, I built one, but the reason I built one is because for years I've been out on the road teaching teachers how to do it. Like, here is the science. It's available to all of you. It's not hard to do. So why? What is it about our system that we are really not doing a great job in our teacher preparation programs of equipping teachers to really understand instructional science and instructional design? And teachers deserve better. They deserve to leave their training programs with a really solid understanding of the wonderful science that allows people like Kent Johnson at Morningside Academy since 1981 to say, I'll take your most vulnerable child. I will guarantee you 2 years of growth and 1 year of instruction, or your money back. And he never has to give the money back. And that's not a surprise to those of us who do what we do, because we understand that learning is really this very predictable outcome, and the independent variables that you can manipulate around the learning outcome to figure out what works for a child, there's a science to it. And it's really this beautiful, simple thing. For years, I've used the learning hierarchy, sometimes called the instructional hierarchy, to organize everything I do. I say this all the time to places. I only know how to do about 2 things, but I know them really well. And so teachers can absolutely employ these strategies in their classroom. And this is what it looks like. So, and maybe I could even send you a slide if you want to put a slide in with
that would
this.
be lovely. Yes, we'll make sure that we share that with our guests. Absolutely.
I'll be glad to send it to you. It's one that I've used for years, and people always take pictures when I'm presenting, because it does make it very logical. So when a child is learning a new skill, if their performance is new, it's a new understanding, they won't be accurate. This is not the type of work that you want to allow them to work on independently. And the reason for that is because they will make errors. And when they make errors that go untrapped or undetected, then those errors have a chance of becoming really intractable for the student. And so it will cost you twice as much instruction later to remove those errors. So at the initial acquisition stage of learning, the tactics that work to establish correct understanding, the goal is to establish accurate, independent responding, are things like immediate corrective feedback, using cues and prompts for correct responding. Your feedback is going to be more elaborate. You're going to finish the feedback with a repetition loop, which just means that you represent the task and see if they can get it right. You can do this class-wide. This could be a process that you're building into individual intervention, as we do. And then once children become accurate, if you continue to use the tactics that are appropriate for establishing accurate responding, you are now wasting and squandering your instructional time. We know this from data. If you continue to give acquisition level support when a child has moved into the next phase of learning, which is really the fluency based fluency building stage of learning, then you will actually cause the children to have less learning. And the reason why is because the things that work once a child becomes accurate and independent, they need different tactics. And these are tactics that include things like opportunities to respond. That's probably your number one variable. Delayed corrective feedback. Why can it be delayed? Because they're not making errors. So if you are interrupting them to tell them they got it right, you're actually taking away the number of learning trials or opportunities to respond that child can experience during that instructional interval. So now you want to vary the task slightly and see, can they continue to sustain correct responding? And you want to build ease and, speed. There's no shame in using the word fluency. Fluency is accuracy plus speed. So that is simply a gift. It's like a vaccination you can give a child that allows them to free up their cognitive space to think about other things, right?
Yeah.
Which is what we want them to do. We want them to think about what they're reading. We want them to think about the problems that they're trying to solve in math, not because they're struggling to write hash marks, to figure out how to find a known and count their way to the unknown. We want to free up that cognitive space. They can think about, what step do I need to take next to understand or unpack this problem in a deeper way. So that's the fluency building stage. And once children have become speeded, so now they're accurate plus speeded, which you only know if you use a timed measure, by the way, then you've moved into the generalization stage of learning. And the generalization stage of learning, this is where your application work can come in. So you typically, teachers don't need this for individual intervention. Because most children who need individual intervention need either acquisition or fluency building support. But what we do, what I do in my world is I build in application work into the fluency building intervention process. And that includes things like word problems. It includes things like giving a more challenging problem type and seeing if the child can get it right. It's particularly important to have children think aloud and teach you how to solve a problem, because they're making their thinking transparent to you. And they're also practicing the thinking when they say it out loud.
So when we think about these evidence-aligned practices, it's really tied to the progression of learning, whether they're in acquisition, fluency, generalization, maintenance, adaptation. So it really is tied to where they are in their progression. As you had said, if we stick to the same tactics, that you might use in an acquisition progression as when the student is ready for maintenance, we're kind of losing ground there with our instruction. We want to avoid that. So we need to be very intentional and purposeful in understanding where our students are at in their progression.
Yeah, the classic error that I think teachers in general education make, especially in math, is they over-focus on acquisition. So their lessons, their core instruction is 99% focused on introducing new content and delivering acquisition type instruction. And they do not actually build children's fluency to the level of proficiency that forecasts the child will retain the skill in 2 months, will be able to experience faster learning of related and more complex content, which is what it's all about. So we see, I use a graph all the time when I present to explain why you need to really time performance to determine mastery. And in this graph, we have real data with fourth graders to show that if you're just saying anybody who is 90% or better in terms of accuracy, you are missing a huge percentage of kids that you're saying really have got it, they're okay. And what we will tell you is in 2 months, they will have no idea how to solve this problem.
No, so be careful of that over-acquisition piece. Not focusing so much on acquisition, but taking care and being direct and explicit about the acquisition and the instruction, but moving them through to be able to do that repetitive loop and retrieve this information in 5 days and then again in 10 days and continuing on to maintaining that skill and that competency.
Yeah, a rule of thumb that seems to resonate with teachers over the years is to think about your lesson planning in 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. So 1/3 is acquisition instruction. So it's introduction of new content, excellent high quality support for the acquisition of new understandings. 1/3 is about fluency building of already acquired skills, so that by definition, that's different content than what appears in your first 1/3 of your lesson. And then your final 1/3 of your lesson is practice with application and challenge and think aloud problem solving and small group projects. And this is the fun. This is the fun stuff that you can get creative as a teacher. But here's the key. If you are requiring children to use skills, this is true for reading, this is true for math, this is true for any content area. If you're requiring children in those problem solving applied contexts to have to use skills that they have not mastered, meaning they are not accurate and speeded, so fluent, they have to be at mastery. If you are requiring them to use skills for which they're not at mastery, the application part of your lesson is lost on them.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. So the rule of thirds: acquisition, fluency, and application, ensuring they have the skills in place to do the application portion of it. Let me ask you this, and we really work hard at inspiring educators out there to grow professionally. We want them to take information and say, maybe I need a little bit more. Maybe I need a little bit more fine-tuning or tweaking or brand new knowledge about something. What advice would you offer to those in the field, to those who are listening today? What advice would you offer to them to help them inspire and grow professionally?
Yeah, well, you have to be careful, because if you just decide, as I do this in some of the trainings that I do, where I just YouTube, how to teach some concept in math, you can find really good lessons and you can find really bad lessons where the person presenting it is like, I am an expert and this is the way to establish conceptual understanding. So here's what I want to say to teachers: be empowered, trust your gut. If it looks like a trick, if it feels like a trick, it's probably a trick. You have to really look at the way in which you intend to deliver content in your classroom and think through, do I understand this? Right? And forget these myths like, visual learners and auditory learners and the importance of working memory and all of that. Forget these myths. It all comes down to this. Do you have a good rapport with your students? Do they trust you? Do they feel safe to reveal their thinking? And then how will you as a teacher engineer the instructional environment for the day to ensure that you are delivering high quality acquisition support? Don't shortchange the fluency building. That is something that, it's tough in the math world because sometimes people have a lot of dogma-based philosophy around, or philosophy-based opinions around that it's not good for kids. And I think they are well-intended and they don't want to harm children, but they fundamentally misunderstand how powerful that is. If you care about social justice, when you help children become fluent and facile with any skill, reading or math, you are opening doors for that child later to engage in more challenging work. So as a teacher, trust your gut. Don't necessarily just believe the local yokel expert who is brought in or the national expert who is brought in. I hear things all the time, like I was hired as an external consultant for a state recently, and one of the state leaders said to me, you cannot use the words direct instruction in our state because direct instruction does not work. And I said, what do you mean it does not work? And by the way, are you aware that your boss, actually worked very closely with the guy who started it a million years ago? Like,
oh, geez.
How can you think this? And you are influencing all these teachers in your state. So be cautious, teachers. There's really an evidence base to the beautiful work that you do. And be thoughtful about whose advice you're going to take around that. Vet it. Make sure it sits with your gut. And at the end of the day, if you pay attention to whether or not your students are learning or not learning as a result of what you do, you will do the right things.
Be empowered, be cautious, be thoughtful. I love those three messages. I thank you so much for that. And thank you, Dr. VanDerHeyden, for being with us today to kind of help us understand and make sure that we're really matching up our students' needs to what it is we're providing for them instructionally, whether it be class-wide or independently in individual students. So thank you so much for that. We appreciate your time today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you to all of you in the field. You inspire educational growth every day in your students. A special thank you to John Ragsdale for producing this podcast. We'll see you next time on PaTTANpod.